Please welcome to the stage Elliot Ackerman, author of Dark at the Crossing, now nominated for the National Book Award, and a recipient of the Purple Heart, the Silver Star, and the Bronze Star for Valor.
Thanks so much, Sam. I appreciate that. And I feel like a Skyped-in version of Gary Kasparov is like the perfect introduction for a brief discussion of the classical text, Xenophon's Anabasis. So I'm going to take you guys back about, 2,500 years. So the Anabasis sort of first came onto my radar screen when Richard and Sam asked me to write a brief piece for them for the Octavian Report about it. And I'm ashamed to say I had never read the text and didn't really understand how it fit in the pantheon of classical writing, and particularly classical writing about war. So there's a saying for those of us who write about war, and or a conception, and that's the idea that really all war stories are derivative of two texts, the Odyssey and the Iliad. The Iliad being the act of going to war, and the Odyssey being the act of returning from war. So where does a text like the Anabasis fit into all of that? And so if you would allow me, perhaps I'll give you a little bit of a summary of what goes on in this. So as I mentioned, it was written by Xenophon. And Xenophon is sort of one of the first soldiers turned authors or authors turned soldiers, depending on how you look at it. And in around 401 BC, he was hanging out in Athens. And he was a Greek of noble birth and friends with all the most interesting people. One of whom was a fellow named Proxenus, and he was a Theban general and a mercenary. And at that time, Cyrus, who was the younger brother of the Persian king, was also sort of traipsing around Athens and somewhat disappointed with his inheritance and his position in life. So Cyrus, who was a very charismatic individual, was going around Greece and trying to enlist people, mercenaries primarily, to go back with him to Persia, although it was sort of not clear what he was going back to Persia to do. And so Xenophon's friend, the Theban general, asked Xenophon if he would be interested in joining up with this army as a common soldier and going to march. So as I mentioned, Xenophon was a man about town, knew all the right people. One of his closest mentors was Socrates. So Socrates, pretty good guy to ask for advice. Xenophon went to him and said, what should I do? Should I go march into Persia? And the advice that Socrates gave him was to go and consult the oracle at Delphi. And this is how it's written about in the Anabasis. Xenophon went and put the question to Apollo, to which of the gods he must pray and do sacrifice, so that he might best accomplish his intended journey and return in safety with good fortune. So the oracle tells Xenophon that he should pray to the god Apollo. And Xenophon very enthusiastically comes back and tells it to Socrates, but Socrates informs him that he never asked whether or not he should go to war. He only asked which god he should pray to in the event that he went to war. And so in reading the book, for me, this is sort of the first time that I start seeing these inklings that perhaps this is relevant today. Perhaps this is one of the early instances we see where people are asking the wrong questions as they go to war. So Xenophon links up with this Greek army that Cyrus the Younger has gathered. And so just a way of background for Cyrus. Cyrus is the son of Darius II. Darius II is recently deceased. His older brother is now King Artaxerxes II. And Artaxerxes is ruling all of Persia. So the thing about Cyrus and why he gets this far is Cyrus is someone who, by all accounts, is an extremely charismatic leader. In writing about him in the Anabasis, it's noted that he should triumph over his friends in great matters of well-doing is not surprising, seeing that he was much more powerful than they, but that he should go beyond them in minute attentions and in an eager desire to give pleasure seems to me, I must confess, more admirable. all that being said, I think Cyrus is the type of guy you'd like to have a beer with. And so, with their charismatic ruler, Cyrus manages to get this coalition of the willing to march off into Persia. Well, they get to Persia, and after a while it becomes very clear that the true reason Cyrus has gathered this coalition together is so that he can oust the current regime and take power from his brother. So, about 60 miles outside of present-day Baghdad, these Greek generals all come together, and they make the decision that they've gone too far to turn back, and that even though Cyrus has betrayed them, they'll support him in the battle to come. And that battle comes at a place called Cunaxa on September 3rd, 401 BC. So with the armies assembled of the Greeks and the Persians under Artaxerxes, the Persians advance step by step, the hoplites, their heavy infantry, anchored on the banks of the Euphrates. And Artaxerxes' army, which is lighter, keeps sucking them in deeper and deeper and deeper into what is now present-day Iraq. Now Cyrus, always being enthused, sees the success of the hoplites on his flank and gets very, very excited when he manages to see his brother across the battlefield. And as Xenophon writes, unable to longer contain himself, with a cry, "I see the man," he rushed at him. As Cyrus delivered the blow, someone struck him with a javelin under the eye severely. Cyrus himself fell, and 8 of his bravest companions lay on top of him. So imagine the scene. You have Cyrus, the usurper, the one these Greek generals have come to support, lying there dead on the battlefield. And you have Artaxerxes still living on the other side, and they're hundreds of miles in what is, in effect, enemy territory. So the battle's broken off for that day, and the Greek generals assemble, uncertain what they should now do, because the advance back to Greece will be long and bloody, and there's 10,000 of them. So after much debate, they decide that they are going to go have a conference with King Artaxerxes. And it's been an interesting day for Artaxerxes. And I think one of the takeaways from the Anabasis, and something that's often, I feel, lost in history, and something that I have been reminded of in my own experience, is just the role that fate plays in war, and how we cannot underestimate that role. So for instance, that javelin thrower, who manages to land the mark on Cyrus, his name was Mithridates. And had Mithridates not hit his mark, you potentially could have had King Cyrus ruling in Persia. King Cyrus backed up by the Greeks. And I think this is particularly relevant because 70 years later, after Artaxerxes was able to rule, and when his son was now in power, Darius III, that's when Alexander the Great entered into Persia. So, but for this one javelin blow, you might not have had an Alexander the Great. And what is not as well known about Alexander the Great is it's often been talked about how he took his copy of the Iliad with him into Persia. But what's not as well known is that he also took a copy of the Anabasis to guide him through the early days of his march. But back to the story, we have these Greek generals, and they've decided to take Artaxerxes' offer and go meet with him in order to discuss a peaceful withdrawal out of Persia. Well, no surprise, what winds up happening is to a man, the Greek generals are all decapitated. And now you have a truly rudderless army wandering around in Persia. And again, talking about the nature of fortune in war, as these 10,000 Greeks are sort of stumbling their way home, pillaging and conquesting along the way because they have no food, Xenophon eventually gets promoted up the ranks and winds up, after about a year, leading the entire army. And they stumble up to the north, they stumble across Anatolia, and eventually, after all this time, they get to the sea. The moment when they should finally be going home. And when they get to the sea, there's actually, under Xenophon's leadership, there's actually a moment where they revolt because they don't have their pay. And because they haven't been properly paid, when the ships show up and Xenophon tries to embark all of them back to Greece, they decide to turn their back on the sea and turn their back on him. And these mercenaries continue to perpetuate their war in Persia. So that's basically the tale of the Anabasis in an extremely condensed version. But Why does that matter today? How does the Anabasis fit in our stories that are traditionally take place of the Iliad and the Odyssey? And I would say it's really a third model of rudderless war. Wars that go on with no conceivable end, wars that are frankly being fought for every single reason but the ending of the war itself. And you think about it, as Americans right now, when we've been at war in Afghanistan for 16 years, and when just yesterday we saw the fall of Raqqa in Syria, and our war seemed to go on without any end, how we understand war and the stories we tell ourselves about war often can be central to us getting out of them. And I would offer the opinion right now, one of the reasons we cannot get out of these wars is we don't know the story to tell ourselves. Our story as Americans, particularly as it relates to war, I would say is the Second World War. The idea of clear beginnings, clear end, a clear peace. But that story doesn't seem to be adding up today. So with that in mind, I'd like to leave you just with a final thought, which is actually from the Odyssey. And it's Homer talking about one of the reasons that wars continue to go on and endure. And many of you might be familiar the scene in the Odyssey when Odysseus, traveling home, sails by the island occupied by the Sirens. And we all know the story of he decides that he wants to hear the Sirens' song. And that these sirens are so alluring. Their honeyed voices will make you get off your ship, and you'll land on their rock and just be consumed by them with all of the delights that they'll offer. And I think in most readings, people sort of, they conceive those delights as being, more corporeal. But this is actually how Odysseus writes it. He says, or how Homer wrote it. The goddess Circe warned Odysseus about these sea nymphs. Whoever comes their way, whoever draws too close, off guard, and catches the sirens' voices in the air, no sailing home for him, no wife rising to meet him, no happy children beaming up at their father's face. The high, thrilling song of the sirens will transfix him. Well, lashed to the mast, Odysseus passed by the sirens. I think what most people don't know was they weren't singing about delights or sexual favors or anything like that. What the sirens were singing of was war and man's glory in war. Thank you.